This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name's Hannah Feldman. Steve Skrovan is off today, so I'm here along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
Good morning to you too. And of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, good morning. This is a very, very instructive show coming up that should fascinate you, listener. Stay tuned.
That's right, Ralph. We're devoting our entire program today to the fragility of American diplomacy with our guest, Ambassador Chas Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is a retired career diplomat who's negotiated on behalf of the United States with over 100 foreign governments in East and South Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and both Western and Eastern Europe. We'll speak to the ambassador about the Middle East, Ukraine, American empire, the U.S.'s indifference to international law, what we can expect from the incoming Trump administration's foreign policy, and America's diminishing global standing. As always, we'll also check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, is it time for America to stop sticking its nose in other countries' business? David?
Ambassador Chas Freeman was a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and a retired career diplomat who has negotiated on behalf of the United States with more than 100 foreign governments in East and South Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and both Western and Eastern Europe. Ambassador Freeman served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in the American embassies at both Bangkok and Beijing. He was Director for Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 1979 to 1981. He was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. In addition to Chinese, Ambassador Freeman speaks French and Spanish at the professional level and can converse in Arabic and several other languages. He concluded his 30 years in public service as Assistant Secretary of Defense, responsible for managing defense relations with all regions of the world except the countries of the former Soviet Union. Ambassador Freeman is the author of several well-received books on statecraft and diplomacy, including The Diplomat's Dictionary, America's Misadventures in the Middle East, and America's Continuing Misadventures in the Middle East. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ambassador Chas Freeman.
Glad to be with you.
Yes, indeed, Chas. Welcome back. And our listeners should know that Chas Freeman is a graduate of Yale and Harvard Law School. And so, Chas, I want to start with the complete collapse of the rule of law, dealing with international law and U.S. statutory law as they relate to foreign policy and the U.S. empire and its alliances with Israel and other countries, and continuing the indifference to the restraints and deterrence imposed by international law as an incentive for diplomacy. So we both graduated from the same law school. I've suggested to the deans over the years that they have a curriculum where the students can specialize in lawlessness, official lawlessness, corporate lawlessness. They're very, very widespread in our country, and have an opportunity to work this area along with the other students who want to specialize in corporate law practice or conventional practice of commercial law. I have not had a response to that yet. Now, let me ask you the question here. Do you see any deterrent to the raw use of military power by international law or U.S. domestic law? I'm referring, for example, to the 6 federal statutes that condition the shipment of weapons to foreign countries on observance, for example, the Leahy Amendment, human rights, or observing, not obstructing the entry of U.S.-sponsored humanitarian aid, and so forth. Do you see any deterrence here? And if you don't, what chance is there for diplomacy in an ocean of lawlessness?
Well, I think it's fair to say that our country led the drive for international law, for an order, a world order that was based on rules established by consensus and legitimized at the United Nations. But we have also led the drive away from the rule of law, both internationally and domestically. And I think the connection is contempt for procedural justice or due process. That is, due process as a concept suggests that the outcome of a decision-making process should be validated by the fairness of the process. Even if you don't like the outcome, it seems wrong to you. If the process was fair, it must be respected. But we've seen both domestically and internationally the collapse of this principle. So we have a response to the outcome at the International Court of Justice, by which Israel was judged to have plausibly committed genocide. And we've seen a reaction to the decision of the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. And the reaction is to sanction the court, not to implement the decision. And we have the same thing going on here at home. January 6th, 2021 was really an illustration of this, in which the public felt that the outcome had not been what a significant part of it wanted, and whether the election was fair or not was beside the point. They were entitled to overthrow the decision. So this is an instance in which might makes right. As Thucydides wrote, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And it is not conducive at all to diplomacy. But we compound the problem by imagining that we are conferring a great favor on those with whom we speak when we agree actually to speak with them. And so we see a situation, we have a war going on in Ukraine, which is quite dangerous in terms of its constant escalation. And yet, in the 4 years that he has been Secretary of State, Antony Blinken has never visited Moscow, not once. His encounters with Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart, have been brief and perfunctory on the margins of international meetings. And we see also that we do not talk to the Chinese. We exchange combative talking points with them. We don't listen to them. They don't listen to us. There is no diplomacy at all on this. And the same is true of the U.S. relationship with Iran. We're very concerned about Iran going nuclear, something I think it is very likely to do now that it has lost its frontline defense against Israel. Yet we don't speak with it in normal terms. We're just seeing a bunch of appointments to proposed ambassadorial positions, which are really quite remarkable. Charles Kushner, a convicted felon to France, that is the father-in-law of Donald Trump's daughter. The purported appointment of Carrie Lake to Mexico, a country that she has gone out of her way to insult, and so forth and so on. You know, it's really almost quite preposterous, but it looks as though if these appointments go through and the cabinet announcements are actually completed with approval by the Senate, that we will have a group in power who basically talk to themselves and their followers and not much of anybody else.
Well, you're good to remind us that the structure of international law was enhanced directly after World War II by the United States leadership, first with the Charter, create the United Nations, and before that with the Nuremberg trials that established many Nuremberg principles. As Justice Jackson said, they don't just apply to Germany, they apply to the United States and other countries in the future. There is a collapse in this sea of lawlessness of any kind of parallel peace negotiation with the Israeli-Palestine issue. And there's also a collapse of extending or strengthening existing nuclear arms control treaties. Could you comment about that?
We did take the lead for quite a while in the development of arms control agreements. These are efforts to reduce threats by limiting the interaction between two or more parties to ensure that those interactions are less destructive than they might be. Basically, after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, both the leadership in Moscow and that in Washington concluded that they had to make a realistic effort to prevent the incineration of the planet. Basically, we came very close, they realized, to the extermination of our species. But the nuclear allergy has greatly attenuated. It is not really in effect. We now have the head of our strategic command talking about winning a nuclear war, when earlier we signed an international agreement at the UN Security Council declaring correctly that a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought. But now we're purporting to win a nuclear war, and we're developing the weapons to do it. In fact, all 9 de facto nuclear powers, that is the United States, the Russian Federation, Britain, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, are all developing new warheads and delivery systems at quite a pace. So clearly the whole arms control framework is broken down. When Mr. Trump removed us from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement in Europe, which prevented the stationing of medium range and immediate range nuclear armed missiles in that part of the Eurasian continent, the treaty was still respected by the Russians, who did not field such a weapon until the war in Ukraine came to the point that it has. And they have now fielded a missile called the Oreshnik, which has both positive and negative aspects to it. It has a positive aspect because it is very destructive on a non-nuclear level, and therefore it provides an alternative to escalation to the nuclear level. It is very negative in that it is an intermediate range ballistic missile that can be armed with a nuclear warhead, and it threatens all of Europe and the Middle East. We are talking now about employing intermediate nuclear forces in Pacific Asia against China, which is, I'm sorry to say, considerably more proficient in the development of missiles than we are, but which is essentially on the defensive. So we propose to launch missiles from China's neighbors into their territory in the event of a fight over Taiwan. And we have not yet received the permission of any of China's neighbors to deploy such weapons, but plans to do so are actively developed. So that whole area of international law, which was a stabilizing force in the world, has gone. And the UN Charter is disrespected, much as the US Constitution is, in its fundamentals. We invade the sovereignty of other countries with no serious regard for the legal prohibitions against that. And in fact, those legal prohibitions, which once were something that smaller countries could rely upon when they confronted the great powers, are no longer effective. Therefore, we see at the local level, the regional level, a proliferation of weapons designed to counter and defend against attack by greater powers. So the whole world is, in effect, arming itself, which is very good for arms manufacturers, but it's very bad for the prospects for our species.
Well, it seems that both parties are on board with ever larger defense budgets. They're giving more money to the generals annually than the generals ask for, with bipartisan Democrat-Republican hoopla in the Congress. It seems like they want to make NATO an even more aggressive force. It seems like they're preparing for war against China. It doesn't look good, but it's important for people to understand that had NATO not expanded into Eastern European countries on Russia's border, it seems that Putin might not have invaded Ukraine. George Kennan said that the expansion of NATO to include Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the other European countries in the East was one of the greatest foreign policy blunders in American history. Looking back, which is important to look forward, you have to look back. Do you think that the expansion of NATO and arming countries on the border of Russia, which has been invaded twice in the 20th century with tens of millions of casualties, Germany, and the Russians are understandably sensitive about this, was the proximate cause of Putin moving into Ukraine?
I don't think there's any question about that. Let me comment on your mention of the defense budget, which is basically treated by both parties as a jobs program and pork for the benefit of campaign donors, including large military industrial complex components. This is the reverse of what ought to be, which is the defense budget should be built to address the realistic appraisal of threats. But there are no realistic threats against the United States, except those that we are provoking. Our view seems to be that the best way to deal with the hornet's nest, I'm speaking of West Asia, the Middle East here, is to go and poke the hornets in their nest. And we get the predictable result, so we generate a threat. And then that threat has to be dealt with, we think. I think in the case of Ukraine and Russia, there's no question that the war was begun as a result of NATO enlargement. In fact, from 1994 on, beginning with Boris Yeltsin and continuing through his successor, Vladimir Putin, we were receiving constant warnings from the Russians and from our own embassy in Moscow under the current CIA director, who was then the ambassador to Moscow, that the Russians would be compelled to react militarily if they saw an American military presence and sphere of influence extended to their borders. Well, NATO is the American sphere of influence in Europe, and it is the case that everywhere that countries have joined NATO, that has been followed by the deployment of American troops and weaponry on their soil. So the Russians reacted in much the same way that John F. Kennedy did to the placement of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, which he thought was intolerable. We prepared to go to war over that. I note that earlier, right after our Civil War, we did the same thing in Mexico, where the French had taken advantage of our distraction in our hugely destructive domestic problem warfare to install an emperor, Maximilian I, in Mexico and to garrison it with French troops. The first thing we did, 1865, right after the end of the war, was to give the French an ultimatum and say, if you don't get out of Mexico, we're coming after you. And we massed 40,000 troops on the border with French, had the wisdom to leave. In December 2021, Vladimir Putin and his apparatus in Moscow issued a warning to us, an ultimatum. They demanded a negotiation of three things. First, the rights of minorities, including Russian speakers, in Ukraine, in accordance with the Minsk Accords, which had provided that Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine would remain part of Ukraine, but that they would enjoy the sort of linguistic and cultural autonomy that Quebec enjoys within Canada. So that was issue number one. Issue number two was the neutrality of Ukraine. Ukraine, when it was born as an independent country after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in its constitution and otherwise stipulated that it would be neutral and non-aligned. And that was acceptable to the Russians. But NATO membership and the presence of foreign troops on Russian border as part of an alliance hostile to Russia was not acceptable. And therefore, third, Russia demanded a discussion and negotiation of some sort of new security architecture in Europe, which could reassure Russians that they did not face a threat from NATO, and the members of NATO that they did not face a threat from Russia. Our answer was to refuse to discuss any of these issues. And when we did refuse, Vladimir Putin was put in a position where he either had to surrender or execute his ultimatum. And on February 22nd, 2022, he executed it. But he was still open to negotiation. And indeed, there was a treaty drawn up at Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia by which Ukraine agreed to neutrality, not joining NATO, in return for security guarantees, and the Minsk Accords were to be reinstated. We, the West, in the person of one Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister in Britain, found this unacceptable and told Mr. Zelensky that he might be prepared for peace, but we were not. This is a history. So there is little question that we directly challenged Russian interests that they felt were sufficiently important to justify their going to war, and they did.
What do you see from the Trump administration? Just a prefatory remark here. Trump likes to be seen as opposed to endless wars as a peacemaker. He said that during the campaign. I'll stop the wars here and there right away. He also has been seen as a very emotional, vituperative, eruptive personality. He just recently threatened to blow to smithereens what's left of Hamas if they don't release 100 hostages, and never mentioned the thousands of hostages in Israeli prisons of Palestinians, men, women, and children that have been languishing for years and were amplified after October 8th, just seized and kidnapped. He also, at one point, threatened North Korea with obliteration like the world has never seen. On top of that schizophrenic type posture, he has nominated very, very aggressive, warlike people. Secretary of State designee Rubio. He has nominated others that have a record of belligerency, which he's going to have to deal with if he is willing to spend the time doing something other than tweeting every day. What is your read here?
Well, of course, he cannot nominate anyone until he takes office on January 20. And it's really rather unusual that he is attempting to do so. It's actually politically quite clever because he appoints people nominally without any apparent vetting of their backgrounds and anything in their record that might prove fatal to their nomination or embarrassing. And basically, he takes the position that, well, if they're not acceptable, that's their problem, not his. So this is the opposite of the normal thing where a president nominates people and then fights with the Congress to get them approved and is embarrassed when they don't get approved. We saw in the case of Matt Gaetz, a preposterous nominee for the Attorney General position, that Mr. Trump just sat back and let his candidacy implode. He has talked about, yes, ending wars. He says he knows how to do that. It's a mystery how he would. I don't think there's a Gordian knot to be cut in Ukraine. It is very complicated. The three issues that the Russians raised are all serious questions. The issue of whether Russian speakers, Hungarian speakers, Romanian speakers, and others have the right to use their own language in Ukraine is something that is guaranteed by the charter of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and is part of European human rights law, and yet it is ignored. So the scofflaw behavior that you cite at home now extends abroad. And I tried to explain, in my view, this is because of the end of respect for the concept of due process, that the process justifies the outcome rather than the other way around. There is no process at all on these things now, except the escalation of military supply. In the case of Ukraine, on multiple occasions said we would not supply a provocative weapon system and then proceeded to do so. And apparently, and this is the unfortunate aspect, General Kellogg, who has been appointed by Mr. Trump to try to negotiate a peace in Ukraine, appears to favor escalation or de-escalation. That is, in order to get peace, he would escalate against Moscow. And that would somehow cause the Russians to yield. But as you pointed out, Ralph, the Russians have a habit of not yielding to invasions and threats that is very impressive. They did not yield to the Nazis in World War II, which is one reason that we're all here able to speak still relatively freely.
So it's pretty grim what the prospect is for 2025. We can't rely on Congress to assert its constitutional authority of the war declaration power and control the appropriations authorization process. They are likely under Republican control, certainly with some Democratic support, going to support whatever Trump does. So this leaves the United States in an unprecedented state of vulnerability, and it's called blowback. Blowback, listeners, is a CIA phrase for movements abroad attacking the U.S. in response to our empire domination, military bases, various forays into their backyard. So the Defense Department, the CIA, the NSA, they all have ongoing analyses, scenarios of possible blowback, not just 9/11 type blowbacks, but modern technology now allows garages in the United States to build inexpensive armed drones, for example, and attack inside the United States. The United States thinks, and history supports that we're pretty invulnerable, surrounded by two oceans, with the exception of 9/11. There are people in this country, Chas, who think we're not vulnerable. And if we're ever attacked, the country will be somersaulted into a verifiable dictatorship led by their Führer, Trump. You can only imagine how he would take advantage of any attack at whatever level of casualties to consolidate his power and crush free speech, his opponents, and any resistance. Are you concerned about blowback becoming a reality?
I am, and anyone who remembers 9/11 should be concerned about it, because that's what it was. If you bomb people, they find a way to bomb back. And if they don't have an air force, they improvise one. In that case, they turned aircraft into cruise missiles. And the media handling of that event was disgraceful. It left us without any real understanding of its causes. So here we are. I think the fears you voice are neither ill-founded nor new. James Madison, in his work on our Constitution, made the important case which was accepted by the founding fathers, that the war power ought to reside with the legislative power in the Congress, not with the president. The president was commander-in-chief of the armed forces and could respond to an attack on the United States pending congressional guidance, but he could not initiate wars. And indeed, Thomas Jefferson, who was fairly hot-headed in some respects, went to the Congress before he retaliated against the Barbary pirates. So the constitutional tradition is well established, but it's been repudiated. There's been no declaration of war since World War II. President Truman took us into Korea with executive orders, not a congressional approval. And since then, we've seen the executive usurp the war power completely. I would say that we are facing grave difficulty abroad. I mentioned Ukraine, West Asia, China, North Korea, which we've pushed into a corner. Even a rat will fight when pushed into a corner. But I would say that the domestic dangers are equally great. The Congress is in default on its responsibilities, not just the war power, but it can't even pass a budget. As you suggested, it does not do oversight. It does not try to do reform anymore. It tries to do smear jobs on people it finds politically unacceptable. The Supreme Court, in my view, is off its meds. It is making decisions that have no real basis in our constitutional tradition. Things like Citizens United, the immunity decision you mentioned in last summer. So there's no comfort to be had in that quarter. And the president is now a monarch. We thought we were getting rid of kings in 1776 and thereafter. We have now got an elected monarchy with even less constraint on the powers of that person than exists in constitutional monarchy elsewhere.
And admitted in public, which is also another dangerous sign, admitted in public, as Bruce Fein has pointed out repeatedly, in July 2019, Donald Trump said, quote, with Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president, end quote. And he proceeded to do that, violating the Hatch Act, which prohibits, under criminal penalty, the use of federal property to advance the political campaign of incumbent president, for example, and appropriating money not authorized by Congress, for example. Why do you think what you are saying, which is really pretty accurate interpretation of our laws and would be backed up by constitutional law experts from coast to coast, why are the law schools not arousing themselves? Why are the bar associations not arousing themselves? Why is the resistance becoming weaker against pending autocracy and American-style fascism? There is no discernible reason other than intellectual cowardliness to explain the silence of 1 million practicing lawyers and all kinds of bar associations and over 200 law schools. Don't they see what's coming?
I don't think they do. I think they're focused on their careers. I think law schools, to a great extent, have become trade schools. That is to say, the questions of jurisprudence, the importance of the rule of law, these fundamentals are not really addressed, nor are ethical considerations. We live in an age in which the Congress is manifestly venal and corrupt. The political campaigns we run are directed by plutocratic contributors in a manipulated democracy in which there are limited choices. The choices reflect the extremes of political opinion rather than common questions of concern to the public, although we have also a stultifying, suffocating unanimity, as you indicated, on things like the defense budget and the use of force rather than diplomacy to resolve problems. This is all terribly expensive. The Watson Institute at Brown University, with which I formerly associated, I've now retired from it, has an institute called the Institute for the Study of War and Costs of War. And we have run up an $8 trillion liability on wars that we've lost. And that is not even counting Ukraine, where we probably are on the verge of losing. And so this money, which might have gone into raising educational standards, removing obstacles to efficient transport, infrastructure investment, development of sustaining our scientific and engineering lead internationally, which we've lost now, didn't go into that. It was poured into the desert sands of the Middle East and Afghanistan, and we accomplished nothing. In the end, the Taliban were stronger than ever and returned to power in Afghanistan. We are seeing in West Asia generally, and North Africa to some extent, the triumph of Islamism. The secular governments that paid at least lip service to human rights doctrines and Western legal concepts have all gone. In Libya, we intervened. Gaddafi was no great champion of human rights, but he was secular. He was not imposing a religious doctrine on anybody. And yet we now have Libya in a state of anarchy, contested between various religious factions. We saw in Afghanistan, as I said, the effort by both the Russians and the United States to introduce secular government concepts, overtaken by the Taliban. We have seen in Israel the removal of secular government in favor of religious fanatics, religious Zionists who disdain any concept of restraint on government power or the rule of law, are defiant in relation to the entire fabric of international law, which was created in no small measure to protect the world's Jews and the state of Israel from the sort of thing that happened in World War II. We saw in Iraq, there was a secular government there, not a good one, terrible one, but it has been replaced by a Shiite religious dominant tyranny. The same thing is true in Syria. Assad was secular. There were many, many religious opinions allowed. He was a terrible ruler, and the atrocities he committed were immense. But we now have a very uncertain prospect with people who were formerly beheading kids and killing families and assassinating people for their religious beliefs in power. They claim they've changed. We can't be sure that that's the case. So we're seeing a general trend pretty much everywhere. And I could add India, where Hindu obscurantism is overtaking the secular government that India had when it became independent. We see everywhere a trend away from respect for law, for the civil institutions of government, the separation of mosque and state, or church and state, or temple and state. And this is clearly, we're entering a very different era in which there are no legal restraints on the misbehavior of states, or for that matter, non-state actors.
Well, there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel here. American public opinion, even though it is subjected to relentless propaganda, look at all the militarization surrounding professional sports, for example, is moving against empire. It's turning against unconditional support for Israeli aggression and genocide. It's beginning to turn against unaudited military budgets, waste, and corruption. So the gap between public opinion and what's going on in Washington, a government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations, and the military-industrial complex is getting bigger and bigger. But it's not organized sufficiently. It doesn't have an organized voice in Congress, and there aren't enough civic institutions being formed to focus this public opinion on the decision-making arenas, such as Congress, state legislators, the media. And therefore, it's sort of a passive rising opposition. And I must say, Chas Freeman, the way you've been excluded is a symptom of what's going on here. That the people who have served in the government and are now out of the government and know a great deal about empire and about law and about corporate power are marginalized by the media. You are not invited by NPR listeners. He's not invited by PBS listeners. You can imagine that he's not invited by the commercial corporate media. Are you doing anything, listeners, to demand that voices, knowledgeable voices, are reported in your local newspapers? They are all over the country. There are progressive veterans groups like Veterans for Peace, the retired foreign service people who have a lot to say to inform their neighbors and their communities. And it's good to call up NPR and PBS and say, why aren't voices like Chas Freeman being allowed to express themselves? They have a record of accuracy, of honesty, of commitment to the true peaceful interests of the United States. They're willing to speak courageously, to challenge empire, to provide truth against power, and yet they're excluded. That is a very bad sign of the march toward autocracy and fascism in the U.S. And the real risk now, I would say, Chas, is Israel has so much power in the U.S. that it could create incidents which would flip the United States into a blazing barrage of empire expansion and suppression in the United States domestically. And they have an incoming president who is ripe for that kind of manipulation to begin with. And he has basically supported the annexation of the West Bank, taking over the Golan Heights by Israel. He is more pro-Netanyahu even than Bibi Biden and Bibi Blinken. So isn't it important to anticipate things like this so that the mere anticipation produces a public discussion that could serve as some sort of deterrence, so that the Israeli machinations, for example, and other external forces think twice about stirring the pot in the United States and creating a cataclysmic situation? What is your view on Israel's forthcoming strategy vis-a-vis the U.S.?
Israel's been very clear from the beginning what it intends, and that is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, to make Palestine free of Palestinians. The religious Zionists who are now in power imagine a greater Israel that includes Lebanon, Syria, parts of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, of course, and even parts of Egypt up to the Nile. So the ambitions are enormous, and Israel has a well-established record of false flag operations. So the dangers you mentioned are serious. But I think domestically, there is a far more important issue, and that is the cancel culture essentially blinds us because it deprives us of access to opinions which deviate from the official narrative or the established wisdom. And as we've seen, this leads to surprises. 9/11 was a surprise. It really shouldn't have been. Blowback is a real thing. The collapse of Syria was a surprise, even though apparently our intelligence agencies were involved over decades in engineering it. And if you are unable to accept opinions with which you differ and to consider them fairly, you are in effect setting yourself up for disaster. And I fear that that is the nature of our political culture these days, dissident opinion. We have a set of corporate oligopolies that sit astride public communication and exercise censorship, rule, deplatform people whom they think are a menace to the established wisdom. And this is extremely injurious, and it is self-injurious. And it isn't just Israel that is able to take advantage of this. Our foreign enemies, who do exist, have an open goal behind. There's no goalie in front of the goal here anymore, and they can just score when they wish.
I have to ask you about the vast undercount of fatalities in Gaza. Hamas's undercount is self-serving. They don't want to admit to over 400,000 at least, because they'd be accused by their allies and their own people of not being able to protect themselves. Netanyahu, of course, has an interest in lowballing civilian casualties. So does Joe Biden. Joe Biden just recently had no problem saying that Assad has killed hundreds of thousands of his own people, but he has far more information about how many the Israelis have killed inside the State Department, Defense Department, and he's refusing even to acknowledge the Hamas figures of 44 or 45,000, which is 1/10 of the number of deaths of civilians, at least, in Gaza. Have you ever seen a situation where the perpetrators of the slaughter get away with undercounting vastly the number of casualties, deaths, and injuries perpetrated by their illegal genocide or military attacks? They didn't even do that in Vietnam. This lowballing has serious problems with arousing even greater opposition to the genocide in Gaza. If the figure reported was over 400,000, it would change the dynamics and the intensity of political, diplomatic, and civic effort on this issue. It's now more deaths than were produced in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden combined. And there's only 2.3 million Palestinians in this tiny enclave, the size geographically of the city of Philadelphia. Can you give us some light on why this is happening? And even though the press knows about it, they still, even the liberal press, still use the lowball Hamas figure.
Well, it's clearly disgraceful. We've seen before during the Nazi-managed Holocaust, the concealment of numbers, but nobody really knew what was going on, or very few people did. The difference now is that we can see this on our cell phone. We can see it in our computers. We see live-streamed genocide, Auschwitz on the Mediterranean, as it were, and yet we do nothing. And this is a testimony to the strength of self-censorship in our media, which is appalling. And it has also done enormous damage. It may have destroyed our international credibility completely. The same president that condemns China for, quote, genocide, unquote, in Xinjiang, where people were subject to re-education against their will and are being forcibly assimilated but not killed, can't bring himself to admit that real genocide is happening. And the reason for this is reinforced by our political system, which depends on contributions from special interests, most notably the Israel lobby. So, you can't persuade a politician to tell the truth if telling the truth will get him unelected or her. So we have a conspiracy of silence, in effect. And you're absolutely correct. The 45,000 figure is absurd. It is probably, as you suggest, only a tenth of the number of people who've actually perished so far. And as if that weren't enough, we can watch live on our screens the imposition of starvation as a tool of war, genocide. Palestinians.
And a recent report by an Israeli historian just a little over a week ago documenting one Israeli Netanyahu war crime after another in great specificity in a report that he put out. The Israeli human rights people will be the documenters of what Netanyahu has done to Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, and other areas that he thinks he can destroy at will. But at a brighter period, you accompanied Richard Nixon when he went to China after the Kissinger opening of China, so to speak, and you were the translator between the exchanges of Richard Nixon and Chinese leaders. Can you throw a little light on that? That's a fascinating aspect of your career.
Well, Mr. Nixon was a very strange personality, but he was a successful politician despite that. And he became a statesman. He saw the interests of the United States clearly, and despite public opinion, which was totally opposed at the time to any opening to China outside the precincts of a few universities and liberal quarters, people went along with the fiction that the government of China was situated in Taiwan, in Taipei, rather than in Beijing. He saw that if not deterred, the Soviet Union was contemplating an attack on China that would have removed as a factor in the global geopolitical chessboard. And he acted to protect China from that happening, which would have been devastating to our position. He had in common with Mr. Trump a disdain for precedent and a willingness to break protocol, as he did by traveling to the capital of a country we didn't recognize, a state we didn't recognize, and meeting with leaders whom we had condemned for years as monsters. But unlike Mr. Trump, he had a deep familiarity with foreign affairs. He was judicious. He had a strategic reasoning capacity that was very impressive. And as a practiced lawyer, litigator, and corporate lawyer, he was a gifted negotiator. I'm not sure that the art of the deal that Mr. Trump wrote will prove to be carried out in practice it certainly wasn't in his first term. Maybe in his second term, we'll see the vaunted negotiating ability he boasts of come into play. And surely the Biden administration has left him enough horrible messes internationally and domestically to clean up if he's inclined to do it and able to do so. We must hope he does.
Did you think when you were translating the exchanges between Nixon and China and the Chinese leaders that it was going to succeed? There was a real determination here by Nixon to establish relations with China, which of course opened up the Chinese economic juggernaut, and we know what's happened as a result of that. Did you have that kind of hope?
I thought it would work geopolitically. I had no idea, nor did anyone else, that it would change China as fundamentally as it has, that it would lead to eventually to Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the introduction of capitalism, the rapid growth of the Chinese economy, the liberation, if you will, of the Chinese mind and labor, which has now returned almost to the level that it historically had. For most of recorded history, China was about a third or 2/5 of the global economy. It now produces 36% of the world's industrial product. It feeds itself. It is secure. It has not been that for many, many years. In fact, most people don't realize that in the last 1,000 years, China was ruled by foreigners for 600 of those 1,000 years. Chinese have a well-founded fear of foreign invasion, and have experienced it on multiple occasions. We are privileged, as you said, with two oceans, on one ocean on either side, the exquisitely polite and decent Canadians to our north and the Mexicans to our south. We are not in the position of the countries that sit on the European plain. There is no physical obstruction to invasion from the Pyrenees to the frozen wastes of Siberia. And so Russia has experienced invasion by the Mongols, by the French, by the Germans on several occasions. And French and the Germans and the Russians and the Poles and others all understand that if you shoot an artillery shell over the border at someone else, they will fire back. We haven't had that experience. Pearl Harbor and 9/11 were really unique. Not since 1812, when the White House was burned by the British, have we experienced anything like that. And we do not have an appropriate appreciation of the damage and the huge gamble that war creates for ourselves and our posterity. So we are very belligerent. We have hundreds of wars we have engaged in since our founding as a nation. And we need to reconsider that, because in the nuclear age, you can't get away with that the way you once could.
Well, let's ask the ultimate question on empire. If you were in charge and you had constitutional authority, just as a hypothetical, Chas Freeman, how would you roll back the U.S. empire, and to what extent?
Well, I think actually there are some useful ideas associated with Mr. Trump on that. I believe NATO should be Europeanized. It should be under European command. The United States should remain a member because we can't afford to abandon Europe to its fate. When we did so on 3 or 4 occasions in the 20th century, we found ourselves sucked back into European affairs. So we should remain engaged with Europe, but Europeans should fund and be responsible for their major defense. I don't think we have to retain primacy in Pacific Asia the way we had. Basically, the Japanese defeated the British, French, Dutch, and American empires there. And then we defeated the Japanese and created a vacuum which we filled. But there's no vacuum there now. Countries in the region are strong enough to take care of themselves. Japan is once again an economic superpower. It's militarily formidable. Vietnam has shown that it can handle any foreign challenge. And Indonesia is rising. The other countries are adroit at diplomacy. Even little Singapore distinguished itself with the quality of its statecraft. And there is room there for a diminution of our role, not an abandonment of our presence, because we front on the Pacific. But we do not need a war with China. There is no strategic gain to be had by going to one. All of the war games we've played show that we would lose somewhere around a half or 2/3 of our navies and air forces on both sides were there a war. And if it were over the Taiwan question and somehow we prevented the end of the Chinese Civil War and the reincorporation of Taiwan into China, the Chinese wouldn't go away. They'd try again. This happened in the 17th century. After the fall of the Ming Dynasty, there was a government set up purporting to represent the Ming on Taiwan. There were 11 attempts by the mainland to take it. Almost 500,000 people died in those attempts. And on the 11th attempt, they succeeded. We just have to be aware that we're no longer all-powerful. We never were omniscient. And the domestic factors that I mentioned have basically blinded us to a great extent to what is happening in the world, which is that other countries are rising. Middle-ranking powers are becoming more independent, not subservient to patrons or overlords as they were in the Cold War. The world has changed, and we have not come to grips with the changes. So I would say first step is to recognize what is changing in the world. Second is to reduce our costs. Our costs, we do not need to be the global hegemon or policeman. We can do much better applying diplomacy, which is cheap and doesn't kill very many people, if any, than by throwing our military weight around. Of course, that would require...
And pull back on all the bases in over 100 countries.
Maybe 1 or 2 that are necessary, but there's certainly not 800 that are necessary. So I would say, look to it, the slogan, America First, is a good one. We should look after ourselves. The world would be a safer place if we did, and we would be better off. We have been greatly favored by nature, not only geopolitically with the 2 oceans you mentioned and the decent neighbors we have who don't pose a threat to us, but also in terms of the abundance of agricultural land, of water, the diversity of our population, the extent to which we have institutions that excel, whether they're universities or formerly, at least, our system of government. And we have so much going for us, and we're squandering it on foreign misadventures.
Taking serious risks in our fundamental national security we don't need to take other than to appease the forces of profit, greed, and autocracy. After President Obama took office in 2009, he wanted to appoint you to a major position, and it didn't happen. Could you explain that?
I was appointed to head the National Intelligence Council, and that is not a Senate-confirmed position, so there was no confirmation process. But there was an immediate attack by the Zionist lobby because I had been critical of Israel for precisely the things that we've now seen. There were precursors to these. I thought Israel was on a disastrous path to self-destruction, and I said so. And I pointed out why. And that was, of course, unacceptable. So there was quite a campaign mounted by AIPAC, by the Zionist Organization of America, and others to make it impossible for me to do the job. And I concluded I could. It would be impossible to do what I was being recruited to do, namely to restore credibility to U.S. intelligence, which had been badly damaged by the Iraq War debacle and other things, and to improve the quality of intelligence for our leadership if I was constantly under attack. I was delighted to leave. If I had stayed, I would have been present at the first meeting on Afghanistan in the Situation Room at the White House when Barack Obama asked whether there was anyone present who thought we should leave Afghanistan. And I would have raised my hand and said, yes, when we accomplish our mission. And by the way, what is that? And I would have been thrown out of the room. So it was a good thing that I didn't end up doing that job from a personal point of view.
Well, unfortunately, we have to conclude a very incisive conversation, Chas Freeman. The one thing I think our listeners may be interested in knowing is the opportunity cost of empire. With all the resources, political energy, military power deployed at the expense of assets rebuilding our public infrastructure and public services, dealing with climate violence, catastrophe, all the storms and droughts and floods and fires that are already spreading in the United States, and preparing for future omnicidal epidemics, viral, bacterial, and dealing with the remedial challenge of global poverty, which is a disgrace to the human race that anybody is starving and lacking shelter and the opportunities for achieving life's possibilities. Those are some of the opportunity costs, listeners, right down to your local community. Because we're not mobilizing as citizens, we are the sovereign power under the Constitution. It says we the people in the preamble. It does not say we the Congress, to whom we have delegated unconditionally our sovereign power. And it most precisely does not say we the corporation. There's no mention of the corporation or companies or political parties, for that matter, in our Constitution. We're entitled to ask, why are they ruling us? We have to resurrect our sovereign power. It happens one person at a time, 2 persons, 10 people, hundreds. It's happened in the past in our country. Formidable movements arose with conversations between 2 people. It can happen again. Thank you very much, Chas Freeman. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners before we close?
No, I just say hear to your coda, your last remarks. Strongly endorse them.
Thank you. And look up Chas Freeman and his writings. He writes up-to-date articles and gives up-to-date interviews on a wide sweeping array of public events that he is enormously knowledgeable about. We're entitled to ask, why aren't knowledgeable people in charge of our public institutions? Why aren't they given media exposure? That's the problem of autocracy. That's the problem we have to face. It starts with us back home. Thank you very much, Chas.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Ambassador Chas Freeman. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, December 13, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Food and Drug Administration may finally move to ban artificial red food dye, the coloring found in beverages, snacks, cereals, and candies. That's according to a report from NBC News. Jim Jones, the FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Human Foods, told Congress last week that it's been over a decade since the safety of synthetic color additives has been reevaluated. With red number 3, we have a petition in front of us to revoke the authorization, and we're hopeful that in the next few weeks we'll be acting on that petition, Jones said. Congressman Frank Pallone urged the FDA to ban red number 3, which is made from petroleum and gives food and drinks a bright cherry color. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Hannah Feldman, along with David Feldman and Ralph, and that's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Ambassador Chas Freeman. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember, to continue the conversation after each show, go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to say we're getting very intelligent comments from our listeners. We read them all, and we benefit from them, and we're going to spend a little time in the coming weeks talking about them. But for those of you who really put a lot of effort into this, rest assured that there are people on this show who are all volunteers who are reading them. So we read your comments, Nancy and Mike and Joe Stanley and Paul Davis and others. Keep them coming.
Rise up and take over power. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up, stand up. Step up. You ought to step up.